So welcome to this is our first webinar of 2021. Hopefully this year is a little less chaotic than last year. So I've got a couple of slides just to kick things off, and then we've got two excellent presentations again today. The first one is from Doug, second from Ankush, and then as usual we'll have some questions and answers towards the end. So as the presentations come through, please send it through chat or the question functionality on the software, and I will gather together the questions and ask them on your behalf at the end. So let's see if I can get these slides working. So we've gone through the agenda, which you've seen. A little bit of housekeeping. So first of all, and those who join our webinars will sort of recognize this slide. A few things. So first of all, a big thank you to the presenters. As we all know, we always say yes to these things and then underestimate the amount of time to create the slides. So first of all, big thank you to Doug and Ankush and all those who are supporting. So we're up nearly 25 already so far, and I see more joining. So big thank you to people giving out a little bit of their time this evening to support this webinar. In terms of questions, as I said, put them through the question functionality. If there's something specific we don't cover, feel free to contact the two presenters on LinkedIn, by all means, and I'm sure they'll be able to follow things up afterwards. We are recording this webinar. So hopefully afterwards we'll be able to release the link for that. And then fourthly, certificates of attendance. So sometimes people ask for that, so please, maybe for their CPD. So just message me on LinkedIn and I will send those through to you as soon as I get the requests. Cool. So moving on, a little bit about, for those who maybe have not joined one of our webinars. So we are the Institute of Risk Management's regional group for the kingdoms of Saudi Arabia and Bahrain. And why are we here? So we've set up the group, and there's some of our objectives, and you'll see some keywords like to promote networking within the community, to support CPD. Even if you're not an IRM member, these are still useful webinars to support your CPD, to raise awareness of the IRM. And a little anecdote. So we set up this group in 2019. Previously to that, generally maybe 4, 5, 6 members or people from the region join the IRM each year. And currently, over the last 2 years, the number is about 20 people per year since we've set up this group. So it's one of the sort of outcomes we're trying to do, share the awareness of the Institute of Risk Management. And then finally, the value of risk management and the expertise of our members. So a lot of our presenters are members, some are not members as well, but again, it's just to promote the value of risk management. In terms of today, it's all about sharing our experiences, our opinions, constructive discussion, and diversity of thought. On some platforms, it seems that if you come up with a different idea, there are many people putting it down, but this is very much a sort of a safe environment. Please ask whatever questions you want to ask. They will be anonymized, and as I said, if I don't cover the topic and the questions, please contact the individuals. Sometimes you'll see some emails come out from me. We've got a IRM web page and a group on LinkedIn. So if you can't find it, just let me know. A little look ahead for 21. We're trying to run, we generally run 4 events a year. We will try this year for 5. If it happens, it happens. If it doesn't, it doesn't. So next one in April. And as always, the value of these webinars is based on, sort of one of the benefits from the presentations. If you're interested in being a presenter, please let me know. You can do a joint presentation. Typically, presentations last 15 to 20 minutes. If you want to do a shorter one, just let me know. So please contact me. We've got plenty of opportunity. Even if you want to discuss what's involved, just send me a message. And then something a little bit for today, a little bit of announcement. So the second presentation will be from Ankush about a large survey that Protivity organized across the region, the MENA region. It's a very valuable survey. So he has inspired us as a regional group. So next week we will be launching our own survey, particularly for this community, so Saudi Arabia and Bahrain. It's new. It's something that's not been done across maybe some of the other groups in the IRM, so we're going to try it as always. You don't have to be a risk professional to complete it. That's something quite important. And we've structured it around, we hear this a lot, the World Economic Forum risks, and so we've structured some of the questions, and you'll see a screenshot in the top right. We're trying to understand at a local level sort of what are some of the trends and changes both in the short term for this year 2021 and in the longer term. So it should be, and we plan to run it annually each January, so we can start to track trends in the region, and possibly we'll run it for a month. So at the April webinar, we will probably feed back some of the results from that survey. It'll be quite interesting to see what's happening locally within the region. On that note then, I'm going to try the technology and pass the ball to Doug. So I'm going to switch my webcam off, and I'm going to, let's see if I can make Doug presenter. He's asked me, am I sure I want to do this? Yes, I'm sure. Right, so I'm going to hand you over to Doug. So if you want to just speak, Doug, to quick comms check.
Excellent stuff. Yep, testing, 1, 2, 3. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you fine, thank you.
Great stuff. Now let's try and hide myself. There we go. Okay, can you see my screen? Okay.
Yes, I can. Yes.
Great stuff. Okay, well, thank you very much for the kind of introduction, Darren, and also to the IRM for giving me the opportunity to present on today's session. What I'm going to do, actually, I'm going to turn off my webcam. I always like to kind of say hello at the start and show my face, so people can put a name to the face. But then I'm going to turn it off to save some bandwidth for the presentation itself, and also just in case one of my children happens to run in the background, which seems to happen quite a lot at the moment. So I'm just going to turn my webcam off. Okay. So today I'm going to be kind of giving a little bit of a run through of some ideas, some tips and tricks that I've kind of picked up over the years to help enhance kind of risk management, the presentation of risks, etc. But I'll start off with a very quick overview about myself, and then we're going to head straight into the presentation itself. So my name is Doug Oldfield, and I've been working in the Middle East in some form or another for the last 12.5 years. Nowadays I've got 2 different hats that I wear for business. Part of the week I spend working for a company called Histogram, who produce a tool for enterprise risk management, as well as an analytical tool for sensitivity analysis, and I look after the MENA region for Histogram. I'm also the founding partner in a company called the Ferryfield Group, which provides specialized services in risk management and risk analysis. So we do risk consulting, we run training sessions on quantitative risk analysis, and we also provide recruitment services for organizations looking to find risk professionals, and also for risk professionals who are looking to find a new organization. So I'm sure that I'll probably know quite a few of you on the call already in some capacity, but if our paths haven't crossed previously, please add me as a connection on LinkedIn. I think Darren linked to my profile in the invitation for the seminar, so it should be pretty easy to find me. So originally the thinking behind today's presentation was to talk through some different areas which people may not be familiar with. Originally I was going to go through 10 different tips, but having now timed myself, I think it's a little bit optimistic getting through 10 in 15 to 20 minutes. So we're gonna go for a strong solid 6 rather than a top 10. But if anybody wants to talk about any of the other topics down here that I was considering that we don't have time for today, please drop me a note on LinkedIn, or maybe we can have part 2 of this session at a later date if all goes well today. So the first thing then to kind of talk about is bow ties. So bow ties were really something which originated out of health and safety risks, but have now spread out a little bit more into mainstream risk management. So you'd look to use bow ties where you've got risks that are a little bit more complex than there is a risk of something happening because of this event, which will result in this this effect. And the reason that they're called bow ties is because in their simplest form, they look a little bit like the image that we've got on the screen of a bow tie. So if I kind of load up a bow tie, just to kind of show you how they work in a little bit more detail. This is the kind of the RiskHive enterprise risk management software, and I'm just going to load up a very simple bow tie that we've got here for these risks that are related to Brexit, and you can hopefully see that the shape mirrors the image of the bow tie that we just had. And so on the left-hand side, we've got three possible causes of the risk. We've got the risk in the middle, and then we've got the effects on the right-hand side. This is something which is quite difficult to do in Excel, it's fair to say, but this is a very kind of simple form of a bow tie. And what we're looking to do is to articulate or define more complex risk relationships than a straight just a simple cause and effect and the risk itself. And of course we can actually take these bow ties and we can actually add a lot more detail and granularity to them as well, to kind of enhance our understanding of the risk, or indeed start to put in our response plans. So this is a slightly more complex bow tie where we've got an assumption on the left hand side. We've then got our causes in between the risk itself, which is in the middle, and the causes on the left hand side. We've got some controls in place which are designed to help us mitigate or control the risk in some way. On the right hand side over here, as well as the effect, we've also got a fallback position and a response which is more immediate, which is now kind of more into the excuse me, into the territory of business continuity management. So really a bow tie it's a graphical way to articulate a more complex risk space, and it's something which can be a really powerful discussion tool in risk workshops, particularly when they can be built up with collaboratively with a team, all feeding ideas about additional controls or additional effects, etc., into the bow tie. And what we kind of tend to see is that much like using a mind map, which I'm guessing some of you will be familiar with the concept, sometimes having a interactive visual representation of a risk somehow frees up some more creative thinking about it. So that was the idea of a kind of a bow tie. So next up, board reporting. So I've got 6 things to get through. I'd normally go a lot more slowly than this, so I have to apologise if I'm zipping through these things. But there's a lot of noise on LinkedIn nowadays about the evils of heat maps. But one of the main reasons for their success is that they're very, very easy for boards to understand and also for risk teams to put together. When you try to explain an S-curve or a histogram to a chief executive officer, that can sometimes be a little bit harder, and we'll come on to S-curves and so on in a little while. In the kind of current age of big data and all the associated tools to help with data visualization, there's plenty of alternative ways to present data out there nowadays, like Power BI or Tableau. And of course, risk management tools should also have different reports that can add value to risk presentations. There's a few in the RiskHive software that I particularly like, although I'm sure that most modern IRM tools will have their own variations. And so if we kind of pop back in here, I guess the first thing I wanted to just show quickly is something called a word cloud. Now, what we've got up here, we've got a program here and some different projects which we've got underneath. So these are all different kind of risk registers down here for this particular program of maintenance and service contracts. And so what I'm going to do very quickly, I'm just going to aggregate those to kind of bring all of my project into one kind of Uber program risk register here, just so I've got a little bit more data. So now we've got a whole load of risks with all of the underlying causes and effects and data and so on. And for me, a word cloud is really an excellent first slide in a presentation. It's a technique that looks at text and to find out which words appear most frequently. So in my kind of program risk register in the background, these are all risks to do with kind of transportation projects, etc. And so what we're going to do, we're going to look for any words in the name, cause and effect, although we could use any of these other options down here. I'm going to generate the report. And so once it kind of finishes doing that, we can see that across my program, this is the number of times that we're seeing the words appearing in our risk description. So we've got 13 times we see the word damage, 13 of delays, 11 of customers, and so on. Over here, this is where we can kind of find the risks in their own risk registers. But if I click this word cloud button down here, we can now see the cloud generates, and we can see at a glance what the key things are that we're most concerned about in this particular portfolio, which are damages, delays, and customers, which are the list that we just saw. I love this graphic personally. I think it's a really high impact, great first slide at a board presentation on risk, or maybe as an accompaniment to an internal newsletter piece about risk culture internally. We can we can also use it as a snapshot, showing us a moment in time, at the start of the project, or maybe at the design phase. These are the things that we're particularly concerned about. And then as we kind of get through execution, getting towards kind of close out, we'd expect to see these things start to change. So we can see the progress of our kind of risk management processes and projects as we go through. So that's the idea of a word cloud. Another graphic that I really quite like personally is something called a strategic risk report. Let me turn off this aggregate mode here. And a strategic risk report. This particular report here, just to kind of, this is a little bit like a flat heat map, where we're using the qualitative data, but we're using it in a different way. And on the left hand side, we've got the name of the risk and the code. On the right hand side, we can see who's responsible for it. On the x-axis up here, what we have a risk score. So we can see our kind of major risks in red, the minor ones in green, and so on. And underneath, there's 3 boxes. So we've got a P, which is our pre-mitigated or inherent risk. We've got our C, which is our current score, which is where we are at the moment. And then we've got T, which is our target score. And for me, this is a much more elegant way of presenting qualitative risks than a standard heat map. And people seem to really like this particular report because it allows us to see the journey or trajectory of risk. And it's also a graphic that's very easy to explain to the board. Now, of course, different softwares will have their own variations on these reports, and it's worth researching to see what works for your own needs. But I guess the kind of the tip here is don't just kind of rely on a heat map, because it's not always something which captures people's imagination, particularly when they're seeing the same heat map with the same risks each time that there's a risk meeting. So sometimes it's good to mix up some of the graphics and the reports that are used in these presentations. Okay, so next up then, so interpreting S-curves and histograms. So I spent 11 years at Palisade selling, training and consulting on their at-risk software. And as a result, I'm very aware that not everybody is comfortable with building models for quantitative risk analysis and running Monte Carlo simulations. I could easily have made this session 10 top tips on quantitative risk analysis, but kind of wanted to mix it up a little bit. But if anybody wants to talk in more depth about the subject, please drop me a note and we can do it offline. But Darren thought it'd be a useful idea to just show you a few of the key ideas. So what we'll do, we'll start off by looking at the 2 main reports that get generated with Monte Carlo, the histogram and the S-curve, and they show exactly the same information, but they just present it in a different way. So if I just load up my at-risk model down here, so this is the at-risk model software from Palisade. Other kind of Monte Carlo softwares, you've got Crystal Ball, you've got the Vose model risk, Saffron if we're looking at kind of project schedules, etc. And the idea of Monte Carlo is that we take a model and we take any inputs to our model which are uncertain in some way, and we replace them with these things which we call probability distributions, which are the things that we're seeing on the screen here at the moment. And these allow us to have different values as inputs for our model. So rather than just having one fixed value, we can have a range of possible scenarios. And so in this model here, we've got some probability distributions. And if I was to start tapping F9, then what you can see is we're then starting to have a lots and lots of different scenarios for each of our inputs, and as a result, this kind of risk-adjusted project cost estimate down here, this number is changing. So with Monte Carlo, we're looking to generate lots and lots of scenarios for what might happen in the future. Now, when I run a simulation, what we then have, what then gets generated is some reports which then show us not just 1 or 3 or 10 different versions of our model, but actually what we can then see with the results from a, let's close that down, from a simulation is more like 10,000 iterations rather than 1 or 3. And this kind of first graphic here, this is called a histogram. It's like one of those bar charts that you might have created in school, where you kind of go and sit outside with a clipboard, you count the number of red cars, green cars, etc. And rather than car colours, the bars here are related to outcomes for the simulation. So here it's kind of cost or risk amounts, but it could also be days or the completion date on a schedule. And so what this histogram here is showing is 10,000 scenarios grouped together. So I can see my best case scenario is a 16 million project cost here, which is on the left hand side. The worst case scenario, which is this 23 million, which is this point here, and everything in between. And so if we want to start then talking about our p-values or percentiles, what we can see is that if I go and change this to 20%, I can see that there is a 20% chance that my costs are going to exceed this value up here, this 20 million. And we call this value here the P80, unless you work in oil and gas, in which case it's inverted and called your P20. And the reason it's called our P80 is because after running a simulation of 10,000 scenarios, we are 80% confident that the project costs are going to be below this number, because the combination of inputs in our model in 8,000 out of those 10,000 scenarios came to less than this value, but there is a 20% probability that they're going to be more than that. So if we want to be more confident in our numbers, then we would increase our p-values. So if I go to my p90, you can see that now we're looking at 20.5 million, and the value is higher. So the higher the level of confidence, the lower the probability of the number being exceeded. So if we want to be increasingly confident in our estimates, if we change this number here, so if we increase the p number, then we're increasingly confident. Now, if we change to an S-curve, on the other hand, we can see that the information up here, these numbers on the right-hand side stay exactly the same. So it's the same minimum value, the same maximum value, and so on. And what the curve shows us is the probability that our numbers are more or less than a certain value. So if we look at the y-axis over here, there's a value between 0 at the bottom and 1 up at the top. And we can convert these into percentages. So 0.8 will give us a value of 80%, 0.6 will give us a value of 60%, and so on. Now, if I drew an imaginary line from this 0.8 or 80% across to my S-curve, and actually I can also show where that would be, then we can see that this point at which my line crosses the curve, if we then follow that line down below, we can then find out what our P80 value is. And so the point at which these lines then kind of cross at this right angle down here, that's then telling us what our percentages are. So here we can see once again that there's an 80% chance that our costs are going to be less than 20 million, because there's this kind of area of the curve here represents 80% of our simulations, or iterations rather. If we increase that to 90%, then the value up here increases and we'll go across to 90% on the x-axis. So S-curves and histograms are really kind of fundamental points of understanding quantitative risk analysis, and we could kind of talk for these for quite a lot longer, but there's quite a few other things to cover. Okay, so let me close that down quickly and hop into another model. So the next thing to talk about then is choosing likelihood distributions for the quantitative risk register. And the kind of the best practice is to multiply, for when building a risk register, the best practice is to multiply together samples from 2 distributions. So one is for impact and the other is for likelihood. And so for a if I kind of go back into Excel down here, for for an impact distribution, we might choose one of those, one of the continuous distributions. But then when we talk about, when we talk about the likelihood, we would normally use one of something we call a discrete distribution. So in this case, most organisations would use either a Bernoulli or a Poisson distribution. Now, when we're kind of building up these risk registers, the purpose of building a model is to represent what we think could happen in the future, so that we can make decisions in the present day. And to do this well, we need our models to be a realistic representation of what might happen in real life. So to kind of model our likelihood using an appropriate distribution, question number one should really be, could this risk happen more than once over the time horizon of my project or investment? So if the answer is no, such as a penalty for a missed completion date, then typically you would use a binomial or a Bernoulli distribution, which are essentially the same thing. And this type of distribution just needs one parameter, which is the probability, and then there's just two outcomes for the variable when a simulation is run, either a 0 or 1. So if there's a 0, what the software is, what the simulation or distribution is telling us, it means that the event hasn't happened. And if there's a 1, it means that it has happened. Now, for events that can happen more than once, usually organisations would use something called a Poisson distribution. And there's others that can be used, but that by far that's the most common. And the parameter that we need to enter for the Poisson is the average number of times that we think an event will occur over the life of our project or investment, such as delays caused by bad weather. And when we take samples from a Poisson distribution, what we do, we end up with 0s and 1s, but we can also end up with 2s, 3s, 4s, and so on. And if I, let me go back into the model again there. Sorry, I'll press Control F5, there we go. Okay, so if I now start tapping the F9 key, what we can see is that we've got here we're sampling a Bernoulli, here we're sampling a Poisson, and so these we can have a lot more than 1 or 0 or 1. We can have 2s, 3s, and so on. And so what we're able to do is to combine these together to give us a quantitative risk figure for this particular risk event. And so we're combining together our likelihood and impact. And so you can hopefully see that when we're combining a Bernoulli compared to a Poisson, there's quite a big difference in terms of our results. And if I was to run a quick simulation, just to kind of give you a little bit of an idea, because often people will just people don't always use exactly the right distribution for their models, and so it's really important, if we want our contingency estimates, etc., to be as accurate as possible, that we start to think about some of these nuances which maybe aren't apparent when you first start doing quantitative risk analysis. And actually, what we can see is that when we kind of run a model, if we're looking at the two different variations, if we're looking at the Bernoulli compared to the Poisson distribution over here, we can see that there's quite a big difference. And actually, if we look at our P90 and P95 here, we can see that there's actually a big difference between our Bernoulli and our Poisson distribution. So it's just something to be kind of aware of in terms of quantitative risk analysis, to make sure that you're using the right distribution, which of course is a very long topic in itself. Now, I just had a 5-minute warning that I've just seen from Darren, so I need to zip through very quickly. There was actually two things I wanted to talk about. There was opportunities and then sensitivity analysis. Now, opportunities. Unfortunately for the risk manager, society has got a problem with the bearers of bad tidings. Now, in a recent study from someone called Leslie John at Harvard University, he found that delivering bad news to somebody correlates with them feeling negatively disposed towards you. So it's not much of a stretch of the imagination to hear that when the board hears the chief risk officer or risk manager talking about threats, impacts, severities, risks, treatments, tolerances, issues, fallback positions, and so on, that on some subconscious level, they associate the risk manager with these things in some way. So even though the risk manager is the person whose role it is to stop these things happening or to mitigate the impacts. And a possible remedy for this is for, excuse me, it's for risk managers to make sure they start talking about opportunities to the board as well. Some organisations are really great at doing this, but unfortunately there's also a lot out there who aren't. So if you're not already doing so, try and dedicate a section of risk workshops to also looking at potential opportunities as well. How can we create value for the business? We're also looking at preventing or reducing losses from risk. And I get that this is a difficult shift. Nobody wants to be responsible for a Deepwater Horizon or a Chernobyl. And I'm sure that virtually everyone on the call's business cards probably calls you a risk manager or a chief risk officer. But I guess the point is, if you can start to manage and present opportunities that make the organisation more money, then I believe that can help turn presentations from a slot which is not always appreciated in a board meeting into something that's more valuable and more valued. So Darren, there was one more that I was going to do, which will probably take another 3 or 4 minutes.
No, keep going, Doug. Keep going.
Yeah. Okay. Excellent stuff. Thank you very much. So the final thing then was the sensitivity analysis, and some of you may be familiar with tornado charts already. Probabilistic analysis using tools like at-risk, OPRA or Safran, they get generated and show you the relationship between your input distributions and your output. So for example, you might see what are the 10 tasks that cause the biggest variability in the completion date for a project. And what I want to show here is a kind of condensed version of the presentation I gave to the IRM infrastructure special interest group a few weeks ago, which looked at how sensitivity analysis is also a technique that should really be used by the risk manager to check the models that they've been given. And if you'd like to view the full session, you can access the recording via my LinkedIn profile or the IRM page. And so if I go back in here, I'm just going to close down this Excel model and at risk. And whereabouts are we? Okay, I'm going to just load up a really kind of simple little example over here. Which, whereabouts are we? Hopefully that's now loading up somewhere on the screen. Okay, yes it is. So I'm loading up a really simple example, which is about setting the bidding amount on for a contract. So it's just a standard Excel model with no kind of probability distributions in here. It's a sort of model that kind of might kind of feed into kind of like an early day estimate for contingency or whatever. It's a really simple little Excel model, and of course I appreciate that often you'll have much bigger models than this. But there's no kind of distributions in here whatsoever. And so the tool I'm using is called a Risker, which is another one of Risk Hives. And while it's kind of loading up, it's looking at all the relationships and formula in the model. And so the first thing that I'm going to do down here is select this selling price, my bidding price here, as one of the key things that I'm interested in this particular model. And so what the software is now doing, it's now looking at all the kind of the relationships, all the functions, all the formula, and it's looking to see where all these things kind of fit together. If I now press this go button here, then my sensitivity analysis is now running. And how that works is that each of the inputs to the model are being changed by plus or minus 10%. And the idea behind this is to measure how much the output, which in this case is our bidding price, changes by as a result of changing each of our inputs. The results then get kind of ranked in a tornado graph like this, and we can see that the number one driver in our bidding model here is this kind of overhead rate up here. This is in cell H14, and changing that by plus or minus 10% gives us a variability of 2 million. So that's the number one driver in our model. If I click this highlight driver cells option, then what's going to happen is that the information from this tornado graph, the ranking, etc., is then going to get applied onto the actual model itself. And so now we can kind of see at a glance the things that are in red are the top 5 drivers, the things that are orange are the next 5, the things in green are the ones below that. And this is the really kind of useful thing about running this type of process is that it allows us to highlight things that we may not otherwise see. When we're working with really big models, mistakes get made, things get lost, things get hidden. And actually we can see over here is that this particular input down here, we wouldn't have even seen this with our bare eyes because it's white text on a white background, but it's one of the key drivers in the model. And for me, this is just a kind of useful reminder that risk management isn't just about physical risks to a project. There can also be risks within the models themselves, and we call this kind of this area kind of model risk. And so it's something else which is definitely worth looking at. So I apologise for running over slightly, and as I said, I also apologise for not getting through all 10 things that I originally wanted to get into. I'd probably spent about an hour doing that based on that performance. So thank you very much. I think we're going to have questions at the end. So
Yes.
back over to you, Darren.
Thanks, Doug. And for when it comes to running over, Mafi Mishkila. You can look that up. Excellent. So next up, we've got Ankush. Now, Ankush has been fighting the technology, trying to get into us. So I'm going to try and unmute Ankush. So Ankush, if you can unmute from your end, Ankush, if you can hear me. And let's see if we can get this to work. So, Ankush, yes, can you hear me? Can you speak? Just a quick comms check.
Yeah, I can. Yeah. Can you hear me?
Excellent. No, loud and clear. So I am going. So
I could hear the relief in your voice then, Darren, actually.
Yes, no, it is relief. Just stop checking the WhatsApp messages. So can you see your the slides? Okay.
Yes.
Excellent.
Yes,
so I will go on mute and I will hand over to you. Thank you, Ankush.
Right. Thanks a lot, Darren. And good evening, everyone. I would like to start with saying a big thank you to Darren and again to IRM as well for giving me this opportunity. And what I'm going to do today is basically talk about the IRM Readiness Assessment Survey, which Protiviti had rolled out last year. And this is the first of its kind survey which is done in the Middle East. We've had similar versions done in outside of the Middle East region globally, but this was the first in this region. And what we came up with was very interesting analysis, and that's what I'd like to share with the group today. So before we get into the details, just a quick introduction about myself. So I'm an associate director with Protiviti in the Middle East, and I have a regional role where I service the firm's clients across the region. And I've been helping companies transform their risk management functions over the last 10 years. And 5 years of those have been with Protiviti. And other than risk management, I also specialize in internal audit, compliance, and business process reengineering solutions. In terms of my professional career, I've been associated with different consulting firms and one small stint with industry as well. I started with Grant Thornton and worked in assurance services and also then moved to business risk services. After Grant Thornton, I moved to KPMG, where I worked in UAE and in India. And then I had quite a long stint with consulting, so I decided to move to industry. And I worked in the audit department of a global technology company based in Europe, and a fair amount of work I did in Europe itself. And then realized that I need to come back to consulting, and I joined Deloitte and worked with the US India office of the firm and worked on projects across US and in India. So from an educational background perspective, I'm a chartered accountant and a CPA, and also a commerce graduate from Delhi University. So that was a brief about myself. Yeah, moving on to the discussion for today. I'll introduce you to the survey first. We'll talk about the demographics, people who participated, and then I'll introduce Protiviti's ERM quadrant, which was the outcome of this survey. We'll go through the key findings and also the analysis by each of the pillars which were analyzed during this survey. Then we'll also talk about how organizations can move their ERM journey forward. And considering the current COVID scenario, we'll also talk about what firms and what organizations can do to or are expected to do as part of the new paradigm after COVID-19. All right. Next slide, Darren. Okay. So So Protiviti launched this first ERM survey in the Middle East, as I mentioned, and organizations of different sizes have invested in establishing ERM functions. And with growing market volatility, complexity, and with pressure from investors and stakeholders, firms and organizations are trying to seek more value from ERM practices. With that objective in mind, Protiviti developed a readiness assessment methodology which focuses on evaluation of maturity level of the ERM practices with two elements: strategy setting and performance management. So this kind of aligns to the COSO framework, which was released in 2017. And not only that, it also provides opportunities for improvement and also provides a roadmap where organizations can move their journey forward. So the outcome of this survey was essentially, as we mentioned, the Protiviti ERM readiness quadrant. I can move ahead there. Yeah, and the quadrant basically categorizes organizations into 4 clusters. First one, initial adopter, then actionable, influencer, and finally leader. So what this quadrant does is, what we will see in subsequent slides, it's basically assesses the ERM maturity on 2 dimensions: the strategy setting on x-axis and performance management on the y-axis. So when we carried out this survey, essentially the idea was to assess maturity of organizations, and we identified 6 pillars on which the maturity was assessed. And you can see the pillars on the screen: risk governance, risk appetite, risk culture, how ERM supports the overall evaluation of strategic options, how it supports strategic planning and forecasting, and finally, business execution, right? And we will see the ERM readiness quadrant, which was the outcome of this survey. Moving on to the next slide. So just to give you a brief on what kind of respondents took part in this survey. So we obviously see pretty much all the industry segments had participated in the survey. From a geographical standpoint, we covered all the countries in the region, and KSA and UAE, being the largest of the economies in the region, participated the maximum with 56% participation. From our overall audience perspective, we essentially got responses from IA and risk department heads, C-suite, board executives, as well as other department heads. And the largest participation, as you can see, came in from the largest sectors in the region, which is government, financial services, and energy utilities. Right. So as we mentioned, the outcome was the ERM quadrant, or Protiviti ERM quadrant, which you see on the screen now. So at the bottom of the quadrant is the initial adopters. The initial adopters essentially do not have a clearly defined ERM goals or objectives. And even the roles, responsibilities of the various stakeholders are not clearly defined. The risk culture typically needs to be addressed and reinforced. Surprisingly, we found that most of the life sciences companies were in this quadrant, which meant that they were early in their stage of adoption. Actionable quadrant identified those entities which were protecting business performance in the medium to short term. And though they had strategic goals and understood the risks that may impact these goals, ERM was not influencing any of the strategy setting process. And we noticed majority of the non-listed companies in this sector, around 62%. The next quadrant was influencer. These organizations were identified to be mature in integration with strategy setting, however, less evolved with regards to methodologies, tools, and techniques for monitoring risk on a day-to-day business performance basis. We saw an even mix of mid-size and large-size companies in this quadrant, which is mid-size being up to 1,000 employees, and large-size entities being up to 10,000 employees. Leaders, on the other hand, being on the top of the quadrant, had clearly defined processes to assist in identifying the risk return considerations, and ERM was proactively contributing to addressing risk and opportunities on a recurring basis. Now, in this quadrant, we essentially found the biggest sectors in the region, financial services, energy, utilities, and government being involved. And most of them had started their ERM journeys quite earlier, 2015 and before. Okay, going on to the next slide. Right, so we saw a significant increase in ERM adoption. Now, 44% of the total respondents fell in the initial adopter cluster, and the total of the actionable and influencer categories were 47. Now, this clearly evidenced the fact that ERM is being embraced by a significant number of companies in the region. Now, in each of the risk quadrants, the next graphic, in each of the risk quadrants, we noted that the risk governance was the most mature pillar, and the overall maturity was found to be around 43%. The next graphic. So we noted an even mix of listed and non-listed companies when we looked at the entire diaspora. It actually had more non-listed companies, 57% as compared to 43. Now, we typically associate linking ERM to corporate governance requirements, which is not essentially the case as we could identify from this result. Next one, when we look at the initial adopter category, interestingly, we had all industry verticals represented. And moreover, 40% of the respondents fell in the initial adopter cluster. Going on to the next graphic, from a business execution and strategic options perspective, we found the pillars were fairly moderate in terms of maturity, which meant that organizations have deployed governance mechanisms on ERM, but they don't leverage ERM to execute business activities and also as a strategic enabler. And finally, when we came to analyzing the leaders, what we noticed was only 9% of the total respondents were leaders. And primarily they were companies from the financial services, energy, utilities, and government sectors. Going on to the next slide. So another analysis from a pillars standpoint, the pillars which we had analyzed, when we looked at risk governance, essentially we found that companies have implemented their ERM systems and they seem to be more mature in this particular pillar. As regards risk appetite, it's a very moderately developed pillar, and most organizations had not clearly defined or communicated risk appetite throughout the organizations. And of course, they were not considered in developing the overall strategy of the organization. Again, the only exceptions to this trend were the leaders, where we found relatively mature risk appetite, and that was purely due to governance and regulatory mechanisms which were fairly strong. Now, when we come to risk culture, only the leaders quadrant, we noticed that organizations were putting in training plans and awareness initiatives to increase overall awareness of ERM. The other quadrants, we found the risk culture element to be fairly underdeveloped. When it comes to evaluation of strategic options, only few companies involve ERM function in this process, and fairly limited numbers have used a structured methodology to evaluate the resilience of their business plan or to evaluate the volatility of performances. From a business planning standpoint, we identified that the chief risk officers were primarily not involved in the overall strategy setting process and business planning process. And finally, on business execution, we noted that all companies have processes and methodologies to identify and assess risks, but most don't follow a structured approach when it comes to risk assessment, risk mitigation, or risk monitoring in a structured environment. Going on to the next slide. So we also given a roadmap or a journey for organizations to move their ERM journey forward. So as part of the roadmap, what we suggested to initial adopters was that they need to enhance their risk governance by defining and communicating the risk management roles, ownerships and responsibilities, adapt structured methodologies and tools for quantifying, monitoring and reporting risks, and also define a process through which risk and opportunity analysis could be integrated with the planning process. For actionable quadrant entities, we suggested enhancing their overall strategy setting by performing periodic risk opportunity analysis, and engage CROs at an early stage in the overall strategy setting process, and at the same time collaborate effectively between strategic planning and ERM function. For the influencers, many of those were leaning towards leaders. We identified opportunities to enhance their risk culture by putting in dedicated risk programs, and also consider risk elements when hiring and promoting staff, and also revisit their business strategies when the risks are not aligned or not within the risk appetite. Moving on, so we also kind of put forward our thoughts on what the ERM function could look like as things move forward. Now, COVID has pretty much impacted organizations, people across the globe, and the impact on risk management is also pretty eminent. So from a strategy and business integration standpoint, what we expect is that ERM should effectively help management in assessing strengths and weaknesses of selected strategies. Going forward, we also expect that ERM would be performance of individuals would also be linked with their overall ability to manage risks effectively. Business continuity and crisis management, which were earlier siloed and not part of ERM, would now be considered as part of ERM to enhance the overall effectiveness of both functions. We also expect departments to integrate. So rather than having operational risk management and safety risk management, ERM would be expected to provide a risk appetite which is across the organization and can be used by all functions. We also expect enhanced reporting and board engagement. So first of all, we expect the reporting lines itself to change. So typically we've seen that risk is reporting to the CEO or strategy, but we expect greater involvement of boards and a shift in reporting of the chief risk officers to the board. We also see greater board engagement. So unlike in the past where the boards would connect on a weekly or on a quarterly or an annual basis, we expect board to be regularly engaged with risk management and risk being part of the regular executive meetings and board discussions. We also expect enhanced dashboards where real-time risk reporting would be enabled with the help of integration with the ERP systems. Now, talking of agile risk management, we expect organizations to not only focus on managing current business risks, but also focus on emerging and disruptive risks. And as we saw in the presentation which Doug gave, there's going to be enhanced focus on risk quantification and other techniques such as sensitivity analysis, decision tree analysis. And we expect ERM to use the heavy IT infrastructure companies have engaged in now to assist in informed decision making. Finally, from an aligned risk management perspective, we see that risk ownership will now shift to higher levels in the organization. We also expect ERM's role to expand to create awareness in the organization. And finally, risk champions who were predominantly historically have been people at the mid-management level. It is expected that people at director level and senior levels are likely to take up these roles. So with that, I gave a brief on our survey, opportunities for companies to move their ERM journey forward, and also our expectation of how ERM would move in the years ahead. So with that, I would like to conclude my presentation and would be happy to take any questions in the Q&A session.
Excellent. Thanks. Mumtaz. Thanks, Ankush. So I'm going to be brave. I'm going to put my webcam on. Anybody knows me, I hate having my picture taken. So Doug, if you're feeling brave, Ankush, you may not be able to put yours on. See if you can try. If not, don't worry. We've got loads of questions, and I've sent Doug his 2 questions in advance, so he's going to answer them first. But to give Ankush a bit of a heads up, so Ankush, I've picked out 2 questions from the attendees. The first question is around you've conducted this survey across the MENA region. Really, to get some of your thoughts, do you see any variances either geographically or between sectors? So that's one thing to have a think about while Doug answers his 2 questions. Do you see any variances across the different sectors and regions? And the second thing was you've lots of excellent advice, but maybe if there was one takeaway, so if there was one thing you would recommend people do tomorrow, to go back tomorrow, and which would you recommend? Maybe 2, top 1 or 2 as well. So if you have a think about that, and while you're thinking about that, so Doug has 2 questions. So I'll read out the first question, and this is something I was thinking about. So the QRAs, we tend to do them and sort of irregularly, and when they come up, we panic over distributions and stuff. And really good question, actually, because I'm the same. As probably most of us tend to use a typical triangular distribution. We type in them in, most likely in Max. And I suppose when Doug's presentation, he used different distributions. So just get Doug's feedback sort of on that question. Is using triangle distribution good thing, bad thing, when to use them, when not to use them? And then the second question was around software. So when it comes to sensitivity analysis, there are different software products, and maybe Doug, just to sort of help us, sort of give us feedback on the different software products. Are they all the same when it comes to sensitivity analysis, or are some better than others? So Doug, maybe if you want to pick whichever order you want to do those questions. Yeah.
Great stuff. Thank you very much, Darren. So can I ask you to make me presenter again for a moment, and I'll kind of answer the one about the triangular distributions.
Yeah. Oh no, you're going to let's see if this work. Make presenter. So hopefully you've got the ball. Yes.
Excellent
yes.
stuff. And can you now see this really daunting looking selection
yes,
of distributions in at-risk?
That's the scary list. You've got the scary list up. So right.
Absolutely, yeah. This is the thing that tends to freak most people out when they kind of start to do probabilistic analysis. The sheer wealth of different distributions, and I think in at-risk there's something like 70 different distributions, and it's fair to say that the vast majority of them are used by absolutely no one, or there's maybe one professor sitting at some university in the Midwest of the US who's particularly interested in using a fresh A distribution or something like that. So I think the first thing to note is that you don't need to panic. You do not need to know all of these. I probably know more than most, but I by no means know all of these. So most customers, I think it's probably fair to say that 95% of customers who when I was working at Palisade would use one of these distributions on the screen. So maybe kind of like 7, 8, 9 different distributions. And so they're grouped into 2 categories. So these are the distributions that we typically use when modeling event likelihood. So does it happen? Yes or no? How many times does this event happen over the time horizon of our project? The continuous distributions, of which the triangle is one. There's a few different ones. Now, I get why people use a triangle distribution. It's a really commonly used one. Everyone kind of knows it. Everyone's heard of it. It's the parameters, a minimum, a most likely, and a maximum are. I think they're really easy for us to understand as humans. And whereas if you start to ask someone what the mean and standard deviation is like you need for a normal or log normal distribution, I think those things don't come as naturally to us as humans, kind of from a natural basis. Now. I also get that one of the key things is it's much better to have accurate parameter estimation than, you know, spending weeks to choose what distribution is not as important as having the right numbers in there. So there's an element of rubbish in, rubbish out. So the first thing is to make sure that your parameters are kind of correct. But just to kind of give a little bit of I guess an overview as to the differences. If I was to go down here and have a look, I've got a triangular distribution in this particular cell, and so let me clear any overlays out of there. Okay, so hopefully you can see a distribution here, which is a triangular distribution with a minimum of 100, a maximum of 400, and a most likely value of 200. Now, one of the kind of the big, or there's a couple of issues with the triangular distribution, which is why typically you'll find that a lot of consultants don't tend to like them as much. The first is that if you kind of look at nature, there's nothing in nature which actually looks like a triangular distribution. So if you take any set of data and you do a distribution fit, which is a kind of technique for understanding what the most appropriate distribution is for a set of data, a triangle will just never be up at the top of that list. So it's something that you don't tend to see in nature. So it's a kind of this kind of slight anomaly. Now, if I was to overlay a Pert distribution on top. Now, a Pert distribution, it uses the same three parameters. So you've got a minimum, a most likely, and a maximum value. But here you can see it's a little bit more like a kind of classic bell curve shape where you've got kind of smoother edges. And you can perhaps see that with a triangular distribution, what tends to happen is because of this straight line that you have here, you tend to have a greater weighting towards some of your tails than you might do otherwise. And if I just kind of change this to maybe 800 and just kind of expand it out a little bit more, kind of accentuates it even a little bit more, you can see that if we're trying to model risks or impacts where we've got these kind of outliers where we have a long tail on things, then with a triangular distribution, what we're actually doing, we're actually emphasizing this area of the tail a lot more than if we were to use a Pert distribution or a log normal distribution. And so what it can sometimes mean is that you're putting too much on your estimates if you're using a triangular distribution, because you're kind of assuming that you've got this kind of large area here, whereas actually the reality is that if we took the 0.650, you know, we've got a 5.5% chance we're going to exceed that with a triangle, and 0.0 with a Pert. So okay, so there can be quite a difference in terms of the results, and of course it's important just to kind of play around with things. Sometimes a log normal distribution, sometimes there's a case for using other distributions, and so that's just a little word of caution around the triangular distribution. I'm not saying that you're wrong to use it; it's a really good pragmatic choice, but just be aware that it can result in this overemphasis on the tails. Now, in terms of sensitivity analysis, I guess the key point about sensitivity analysis is that there's kind of almost there's two different approaches really. The first is that when we build a model using at risk, we run a simulation, we generate our kind of results. Oops, whereabouts are we? And actually, I'm not going to have much in my tornado graph here because I've only got two different inputs, so it's not the best example. But when we use an at risk or a crystal ball or a saffron or whatever it is, when we want to look at our tornado graphs, then what we're doing, we're looking at those tornado graphs, and they represent the results of our simulation. So they show us when we run a simulation what are the kind of the top 10 or the top 20 drivers, and those are derived through the use of these probability distributions. Now, the tool that I showed before, which is a Risker, and I think there's some other ones around. You don't have to put a distribution into the model in order to use them. All they do, they take all the inputs to the model and they change it by a certain amount in order to see how much it varies. So you'd use an Risker or one of the other tools to almost like to pre-screen your models before you start applying an at-risk or a crystal ball, because what you can then do, you can find out what are the kind of the most significant elements in your model, and you can have a very, very big model with thousands and thousands of cost items in. And so using something like an Ariska to doing that sensitivity analysis beforehand means that you can, rather than having to put in at-risk distributions on 6,000 items, you could maybe concentrate on the top 10 or top 20 or top 30 and just look at modeling those. So it's so there's just there are two different techniques. I think when it comes to sensitivity analysis, it's not necessarily there's a better or worse. I don't think you're going to get anything different from a Vose model risk or a crystal ball or an at-risk. You're going to get a broadly similar result, but it's just whether or not you want to incorporate probability distributions in your sensitivity analysis, or whether you want to run sensitivity on analysis on a model with no distributions in. Hopefully that kind of made sense. It's not the easiest concept to explain.
So two excellent questions and two amazing answers as well. Really appreciate. I think that's been really, really useful, Doug, and I think it's for explaining it so well. So you're off the hook now. There are your two questions. So I'll hand over then to Ankush. So just a reminder, Ankush, the first one was around, do you see either in the survey or anecdotally variances in maturity across either geographical regions or sectors? And then the second one, if there was a takeaway, something we go do tomorrow as risk professionals.
Right. So so answering the first one, see, this survey which we did was the first in the Middle East, but a similar survey has been done globally. So first I'll give you a global versus ME kind of comparison. So Middle East in terms of maturity is in early stages. When we look at these different pillars and look at maturity of those pillars and compare the global numbers with the Middle East numbers, there's a stark difference. So what we're looking at is these pillars at the global level would be sitting at somewhere around upwards of 75 or 80, whereas for Middle East we are just beginning to adopt risk management, and these numbers sit at their early 40s. So that's a difference between global and Middle East as per se. Now, having said that, in the Middle East, what we see, there are two approaches which organizations take. Some take a compliance-based approach where they want to adopt risk management purely from a compliance standpoint. They don't see any value add in it as such. So there are a spectrum of companies, who are focused more on ticking the box and doing it, only to ensure that they comply with the regulations. And we've seen that mostly in organizations in countries like Kuwait, Bahrain, etc. In the larger economies, KSA and UAE, where there isn't a regulation as such, and the organizations which are adopting ERM, we see them adopting it at a more larger scale. They are slowly ramping up their capacity and they want to have more mature practices. So I think that's the difference. Obviously, financial services being heavily regulated need to have certain regulatory risk management requirements in place, so they are more mature. And the other sectors are government and energy utilities, where again we see, considering the size of their operations, they tend to invest more in risk management. So I think that covers kind of the first question.
No, really, really, really good answer. And then maybe if there was a takeaway that
yes.
maybe you would recommend.
So in terms of the takeaway, right? So I think COVID has been a wake-up call for most organizations. So far, all the organizations were looking at ERM as more a tick in the box. Now they want to derive some value out of ERM and help and use ERM to kind of help them in business decision making. So to give you an example, a lot of organizations are now doing an operational resilience assessment, where they want to assess basically how resilient their different functions are. They want to assess the maturity of their ERM functions as well. So a lot of organizations are investing in it, and use of certain techniques such as sensitivity analysis for, let's say, my cash flow, which is cash is now king. So use of all these tools and techniques which risk management provides, I think that will be definitely a value add, and that's what risk practitioners should think about. That when they go back, are they really driving or are they really giving the benefits which boards expect them to give?
Excellent. No, thank you. No, thanks, Ankush. No, two excellent questions and two amazing answers. So So okay, so I'll probably start wrapping it up now. So and sort of getting into the evening now. So again, just three key points. So one, if you're interested today, so again, the bar, we've been so lucky over the last couple of years to have some amazing presentations, and again this evening, to me, very different presentations, but excellent. It feels like we've had some free consultancy as well, some excellent advice and hints and tips on two very different topics. If you would be interested in being a presenter, as I said before, get in contact, have a chat. You can present different topics. You don't need to be a risk professional. You know, as long as the presentation there's got an element of or link to risk, please let us know. As I said before, big thank yous to our two amazing presenters, the time they've put into preparing the presentations for today, and also our attendees. We peaked at nearly just under 40, just at the peak in the middle, tailing off again. But as I said, it's getting into the evening now. And then finally, a reminder: if you need a certificate of attendance for your CPD, just please maybe message me on LinkedIn. And then lastly, just watch out. You'll probably see it on LinkedIn. We're going to have sort of Ankush has inspired us as a committee to have our own sort of small survey as well. So it's been great inspiration. So watch out for that next week. One thing, Ankush, there was one quick question. So when in the year do you conduct the survey, just so that people can watch out for it? When normally in the year?
So we did it for the first time in May, but we will probably do it again next year. And we will definitely let you know when it will be done, so that people across the group can participate. Yeah.
So when that happens, we'll just as a appreciation, we'll put that link on our group on LinkedIn. So
sure.
On that note, everybody, have a great evening. Shukran wa ma salama. Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Cheers. Bye bye.
Thank you, Darren. Bye bye.